Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I didn't attend my parents' eviction. I was at home, barefoot, in my kitchen, stirring a pot of chili, watching it unfold live on the security camera feed I'd installed months ago. I had it streaming on my tablet, propped against a stack of cookbooks right next to the salt. It wasn't malicious, at least not at first. I just wanted to see what would happen when the world they'd built on illusions finally collapsed. But as I watched them stumble out the front door, boxes in their arms, a few neighbors pretending not to stare, something inside me burned with a dark, quiet satisfaction. The truth is, this story didn't start with that eviction. It didn't even start when I married Jake, though that's the moment everything cracked open. It started earlier, years earlier, when I realized my parents didn't love me. Not really. They loved the version of me that fit neatly into their polished world, their cocktail parties and weekend tennis matches, their beige country club decorum and name-dropping dinners with people who smiled too wide and cared too little. But the real me, the one who laughed too loudly, the one who wanted to feel something real, the one who fell in love with a mechanic who could fix anything except the way my mother looked at him, that version wasn't welcome. I met Jake on a rainy Tuesday when my car broke down on the side of Route 32. He didn't wear a tie, didn't care about wine pairings, didn't know the difference between a trust fund and a money market account. But he listened. Really listened. When he spoke, it wasn't in half-truths or subtle insults wrapped in compliments. He was honest, warm, real. And he loved me with a quiet intensity that made me feel more seen than I ever had in my parents' cold, echoing house. I remember calling my mother that night, excited like a teenager, telling her I'd met someone special. Her voice was flat. A mechanic, she said, like I'd told her I was dating a stray dog. They didn't scream. That wasn't their style. My parents preferred silence as punishment, icy glares as weapons. They didn't show up when Jake proposed. They skipped the engagement party, sent a check instead, and signed, as if to leave plausible deniability. But they came to the wedding. Oh, they came, dressed like royalty attending a peasant's ceremony, faces tight, lips thinner than ever. My mother took the microphone at the reception. She raised her glass, smiled that brittle smile she'd perfected over the years, and toasted to phases, lessons, and the hope that our children always find their way back to what they truly deserve. I stood there, stunned, smiling through clenched teeth while Jake held my hand under the table so tightly I thought my bones might crack. After that, I stopped trying to win their approval. But some part of me, some pitiful, stubborn piece, still wanted to believe they'd come around. So when the trust fund my grandfather left me matured, I did what I'd always done. I helped. I paid their mortgage through a side account they never asked too many questions about. They assumed it was some auto payment from their business investments or whatever lie they needed to believe to keep the fantasy going. I let them think it. Maybe I wanted them to. Maybe I thought that if I kept showing up in secret ways, they'd one day see me again, not the disappointment, not the black sheep, but their daughter. But they didn't. They just kept going, kept hosting dinners with their perfect friends and pretending I didn't exist. My mother told people I'd moved out west, like I'd joined a cult or gone rogue in the desert. My father once told a friend at a party that Jake wasn't around much these days, as if I were some estranged widow drifting in disgrace. And still, every month, that payment cleared. Every month, I gave them a lifeline while they pretended I'd disappeared. People ask why I didn't say anything, why I didn't confront them, cut them off, send a letter, or stand on their doorstep and scream. But it's hard to explain what it feels like to be erased so subtly, so consistently, that you start questioning your own existence. I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. So I let them keep taking. I let them think I was gone. I watched from the shadows, invisible, yet still holding up the roof they slept under. But what they didn't know was, I was still paying their damn mortgage. There's something twisted about being the family disgrace and the financial backbone at the same time, something quietly suffocating that gnaws at your gut while you smile and pretend everything's fine for the sake of civility. I didn't grow up imagining that one day I'd be wiring mortgage payments for a house I was no longer welcome in, a house where my photo had likely been taken down from the mantel, replaced with a decorative candle or some over-polished family heirloom meant to erase me altogether. But month after month, the money kept leaving my account, flowing through that trust fund my grandfather set up back when people still believed blood meant loyalty and family didn't eat its own when it didn't match the dinnerware. At first, I told myself it was just a temporary solution, a bit of help while my parents got their finances in order. They never outright asked me to pay the mortgage, not in so many words, but there were hints, subtle manipulations disguised as casual remarks. My father, with his empty optimism and fading business ventures, would mention a rough quarter. Over a coffee meeting he always insisted on holding in a neutral cafe, never at my place, never with Jake. He'd smile that half smile, rub his temples, and mutter things like, "Just until things turn around," or "You're in a good spot, aren't you, kid?" And I'd nod, even though my insides twisted every time he said it, because it felt less like a question and more like an accusation wrapped in a compliment. My mother was even better at it. She didn't need words, just her tone, her pauses, her choice of silence at the exact right moment. One afternoon, she called to say the roof might need replacing. She didn't ask me to cover it, not directly, but the way she sighed into the phone, the way she said, "It's just hard when your father won't admit he's not 30 anymore," made it impossible not to feel responsible. The next day, I made the transfer. I didn't tell Jake. I didn't tell anyone. I just swallowed it like every other piece of pride I'd sacrificed since the day I signed my marriage certificate and my parents signed me off their emotional payroll. Sometimes I wonder why I kept doing it. Why I allowed myself to carry the weight of a family that refused to carry me. And the truth is, part of me still craved something from them. Approval, maybe, or even just a shred of recognition that I hadn't vanished entirely. That I wasn't just a stain on their white-gloved reputation. I thought maybe, if I kept showing up financially, they'd eventually meet me halfway emotionally. I thought love could be earned like a credit score, build up enough points, and maybe you'd qualify again. But love doesn't work like that, and neither did they. And here's where I want to ask you something, because I know I'm not alone in this. Have you ever had family treat you like garbage, but still expect you to show up for them emotionally or financially? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments, because honestly, I'm not sure I'm the villain here. Maybe I'm just the fool who kept writing checks hoping they'd come attached to forgiveness. Jake started noticing the bank statements. He wasn't nosy, just observant. One night, while we were sitting on the porch drinking cheap wine from mismatched mugs, he asked, gently, if I was still sending money to my parents. I paused, looked out at the horizon like the answer might be hiding somewhere in the dusk, and then nodded. He didn't get angry, didn't raise his voice. He just said, "You don't owe them a damn thing, Rachel," and then kissed my forehead like it was the saddest truth he'd ever had to speak out loud. But guilt is a quiet addiction, and I was hooked on it. I told myself I was doing it for my grandfather's legacy, that I didn't want the house to go into foreclosure under his name. I told myself it wasn't about them, it was about principle, about being the bigger person. But deep down, I knew it was about me. About the parts of me that still hoped for a different ending, one where they saw me, respected me, maybe even missed me. Still, the money flowed. They never thanked me. Never asked questions. Just continued on, pretending I was gone while cashing every single check like clockwork. And then, slowly, I started noticing the shift again, the cold distance creeping back in, the subtle signs that my mother was withdrawing once more. Calls returned days late, if at all. Invitations to family dinners mysteriously lost in the mail. My father conveniently forgetting to mention business updates he used to overshare. But the checks kept getting cashed. Every single one. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of day where the world feels still and nothing seems urgent, the kind where you can almost believe life is simple again if you squint hard enough and hold your breath. Jake was outside changing the oil on the truck, and I was curled up on the couch with my legs tucked under me, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, half looking, half numbing. I didn't expect to find anything, certainly not the post that would change everything, but there it was, smiling back at me in full, glowing, high-resolution betrayal. My sister Danielle, dressed to the nines in a pale blue cocktail dress, holding a champagne flute in one hand and clinging to her new fiancé's arm with the other. He looked like every man my parents wished I'd married, tall, polished, smug, with the kind of jawline you only see in pharmaceutical commercials and investment brochures. The caption read, "A perfect evening celebrating Stephen's birthday with family and friends. So lucky to have found someone who fits right into our world." That last part hit me like a punch to the ribs. But it wasn't the caption that broke me, it was the comment my mother had left underneath, simple and sharp like a shard of glass pressed to the skin. "Finally someone who fits in our world." I sat there, staring at the screen, letting the words blur and warp under my breath. I read it again and again, as if repetition could dull the sting, but it only deepened it. Not a single call. Not a text. Not even a courtesy invitation. I hadn't just been excluded, I'd been erased, scrubbed clean from the family narrative like a coffee stain on an expensive tablecloth. They didn't forget me. They deliberately chose to pretend I didn't exist. And while they were sipping champagne and posing for photos in the very house I paid for, I was sitting in sweatpants, too stunned to even cry. When Jake came inside, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag, he found me sitting there, motionless, the phone still glowing in my hand. He sat beside me without asking, leaned in close, and looked at the photo over my shoulder. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. After a moment, he spoke softly but firmly, the words slipping out with the weight of something that had been building for far too long. "Why the hell are we still paying for their damn house, Rachel?" I didn't have an answer. Not one that made sense, not one that held up under the light of this latest betrayal. I opened my mouth, but only silence came out. All I could hear were echoes of my mother's voice, that cold, clipped tone she used when discussing people who don't belong, or relationships that serve no purpose. I thought of every check I'd written, every transfer I'd made, every time I'd told myself that maybe, just maybe, things would change. But they hadn't. They never would. I wasn't their daughter anymore, not in any way that mattered. I was just the ghost in their foundation, the invisible support beam they never thanked, never acknowledged, and certainly never loved. The thing is, guilt doesn't just disappear because you realize you've been wronged. It clings to you, wraps around your ribs like ivy, whispers all the reasons why you should keep giving even as you bleed. I had built a prison for my own generosity, and my parents had decorated it with fine china and crystal stemware. But now, something inside me was shifting. The pain was still there, raw and gnawing, but beneath it was something new, anger, sharp and cold and oddly clarifying. I started thinking about every time they'd treated Jake like a placeholder instead of a partner. I remembered the way my mother had once offered me the name of a divorce attorney, just in case, as if Jake were a temporary inconvenience she could help me remove, like a chipped nail or an unwanted stain on a blouse. I thought about my father calling him the handyman in front of his friends, followed by that smug chuckle that always made me want to throw something. They didn't care about my happiness. They cared about image, about pedigree, about the illusion of perfection. And I had enabled it, funded it, and kept the whole charade from collapsing with my own damn money. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and my heart pounding. I logged into the trust account, hovered over the auto payment settings, and stared at the screen. My fingers trembled, but I clicked through every step. I didn't delete the payments, not yet, but I paused them quietly, deliberately. No message, no warning. Just silence. I wanted to see how long it would take them to notice. I wanted to see how much they'd care when the house started whispering that something had changed. I didn't tell Jake, not right away. I needed this moment to myself, this first step toward something that felt dangerously close to freedom. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, I was no longer just their shame wrapped in a blank check. I was done pretending they still deserved my loyalty. Time has a funny way of crawling and sprinting at the same time, especially when you're waiting for people to realize that the ground beneath them has shifted. After I paused the payments, there wasn't an explosion. There wasn't even a ripple at first. The house didn't collapse overnight, the lights didn't flicker, and nobody came pounding on their front door demanding answers. It was quiet, eerily quiet, and for a few weeks, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, if maybe they'd found another way to cover the costs or simply hadn't noticed what I'd done. But eventually, the silence began to crack, and I started seeing the unraveling in subtle, almost poetic fragments. It started with a pile of unopened envelopes sitting on the hallway console, the kind of mail my mother used to sort through with surgical precision, color-coded and clipped together with those ridiculous gold binder clips she always insisted made her feel organized. Now, they were tossed aside like junk flyers, each one stamped with words like urgent and final notice, though she brushed them off with a casual flick of her hand, muttering phrases like, "Probably just another bank offer," or "They always send this crap before tax season." But even then, I could tell something had shifted. The air in that house, once so prim and controlled, had grown heavy with denial. You can only ignore the truth for so long before it starts pushing its way in through the cracks in your perfect wallpaper. I kept my distance, physically and emotionally, but I kept watching, like a silent ghost perched on the edge of their world, unseen but always observing. I'd drive past the house sometimes, just to see if anything had changed. One day, I noticed a bank notice taped to the door, the kind that's supposed to blend in but never really does. Another day, I saw my father standing on the front lawn, yelling into his phone, his face red and lined with frustration, pacing back and forth like a man trying to convince himself that control hadn't completely slipped through his fingers. It was strange how peaceful I felt watching it all unfold. Not joyful, not triumphant, just still, as though I had finally stepped out of the chaos they dragged me through and was now standing safely on the other side of a glass wall. There was no need for confrontation, no dramatic speeches or tearful phone calls. I didn't need to scream or demand apologies. I just needed to let time do what time does best, reveal the truth. Every missed payment, every ignored letter, every moment they refused to acknowledge their dependence on the daughter they had so easily discarded was now quietly shaping their downfall. Sometimes I imagined what their conversations must have sounded like behind closed doors. Maybe my mother blamed my father, accusing him of mismanaging their finances or forgetting to pay some bill. Maybe he snapped back, claiming she'd overspent again or neglected to follow up with the mortgage company. Maybe they argued about calling me, just once, to ask what happened, but neither willing to be the one to admit that they needed me. That would have shattered the illusion they'd built so carefully, the one where I was the problem and they were the injured party. But they didn't call. They didn't write. They didn't show up at my door or even send one of those cold, clipped messages my mother was so good at crafting when she needed to say something without actually saying anything. Instead, they scrambled. I could see it in the way my sister's social media posts grew more strained, more curated, filled with hollow captions about gratitude and resilience that reeked of desperation. I heard through mutual acquaintances that my father had started taking consulting gigs he used to scoff at, and my mother had begun selling off pieces of her precious antique collection, the same pieces she once refused to let me touch as a child, claiming they were family heritage too valuable for common use. Still, not a word from either of them. Jake knew what was happening, of course. He didn't ask for updates, but he didn't need to. He saw the lightness in my shoulders, the way I laughed more easily, the way I slept without curling into a knot of guilt each night. He didn't say, "I told you so," even though he could have. He just held me, quietly and fiercely, like he was proud of me even if I wasn't sure I deserved it. And then one day, just as the dust seemed to be settling into some twisted version of justice, my phone rang. I was in the grocery store, halfway between the frozen vegetables and the overpriced artisan bread section, when I saw the number flash across the screen. It wasn't saved in my contacts anymore. I deleted it years ago in one of those impulsive fits of self-preservation, but I recognized it instantly. That area code, that sequence of digits etched into my muscle memory from childhood, burned back to life with one glance. I stood there, phone in hand, frozen between the Brussels sprouts and the sourdough, heart thudding in my chest like it was trying to climb out through my ribs. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at it, watching the screen vibrate softly in my palm, wondering what kind of voice was waiting on the other end. A voice full of desperation? Regret? Accusation? Or maybe just more silence wrapped in forced civility? And in that strange limbo between rings, I realized something terrifying and thrilling all at once. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear it. The call didn't come from my mother, not even from my father, but from my sister Danielle, the only one who ever managed to weaponize her voice with both self-righteous indignation and high-pitched hysteria in equal measure. I saw her name flash across my phone screen in the middle of a rainy Tuesday, the kind of day where the sky feels too heavy and everything smells faintly of regret. I almost didn't answer, almost let it ring into oblivion like I'd done so many times before. But something in me, some mixture of morbid curiosity and residual obligation, pulled my finger toward the screen. I answered. I shouldn't have, but I did. Before I could say hello, her voice exploded through the receiver, sharp enough to cut glass and loud enough to echo in my eardrum for hours afterward. How could you let this happen, Rachel? What the hell is wrong with you? No greeting, no preamble, not even a breath between words, just pure fury wrapped in disappointment, like I'd just pushed our parents off a cliff with my bare hands instead of simply letting gravity take its long overdue course. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence stretch between us, let her rant roll on while I stood in the middle of my living room, one hand resting on the back of a chair, the other gripping the phone like it might bite me. They're being evicted, she snapped, when it became clear that my silence wouldn't feed her rage. Did you know that? The bank foreclosed the house. The sheriff showed up this morning with a damn notice. Their stuff, our family stuff, is being moved out as we speak. And you didn't even warn them? You just sat there and watched this happen like some vindictive psychopath. Her voice cracked at the end, and for a moment I heard something beneath the anger, fear, maybe, or shame. It was hard to tell. I breathed in slowly, let the words settle, and when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, even. I didn't yell. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. I simply said, they always said they didn't need me, Danielle. I just believed them. There was a beat of stunned silence on the other end, and I imagined her standing in her polished kitchen, still dressed from the chaos of the morning, phone pressed to her cheek, lips parted in disbelief. She sputtered a few words, tried to regroup, then launched back into her favorite weapon, guilt. You've always been like this, she hissed, cold, selfish, playing the victim while acting like you're better than everyone else. You could have helped them. You knew this would happen, and you chose to let them fall. Who does that to their own parents? And there it was, the familiar refrain, the same tune they'd been humming since the day I left that world behind. But this time, something in me refused to dance to it. I didn't backpedal. I didn't let her twist the narrative into something that made her feel righteous. I told her the truth she didn't want to hear. They didn't tell you, did they? I asked, my voice almost gentle. That I was the one keeping that house afloat for the last couple of years? That I paid the mortgage every month while they pretended to be financially secure? That they took my money while pretending I didn't exist? She didn't respond right away, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as the pieces started falling into place. I continued, not out of cruelty, but because I was done holding the weight of their lies. They never told anyone because they didn't want to admit they needed me, I said. Because admitting they needed me would have meant acknowledging I wasn't a mistake. That marrying Jake didn't ruin their perfect world, it exposed it. I expected another outburst, some desperate attempt to spin the story back into their favor. But Danielle stayed quiet, and for once, I didn't feel guilty about filling the silence. I felt free. Strangely, I felt light. And then, just as I was about to end the call, I dropped the last truth she deserved to hear, one final detail, slipped in like a quiet blade. By the way, I said, almost conversationally, the house? I bought it. She didn't speak, but I could hear the breath hitch in her throat, sharp and brittle. I bought it last month, through a separate LLC, I continued. Different name. Different paperwork. They'll never know unless I tell them. I wasn't planning to, but since you called, I let the words hang there, unspoken implications dangling in the air like smoke from a slow-burning fire. I could have added more, Could have told her about my plans for the property, but I didn't. I just let her sit in the weight of that final twist, because sometimes silence is the only language people like my family truly understand. And as I hung up, I realized something strange and beautiful. I didn't feel like a villain. I felt like a woman who finally stopped bleeding for people who never once handed her a bandage. I stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping inside, the silence of the place pressing against me like a memory that hadn't decided yet whether to comfort or confront me. The house felt hollow now, not just physically stripped of furniture and belongings, but emotionally emptied, as though every echo of laughter, every sharp word, every brittle dinner conversation had been carefully boxed up and hauled away with the rest of their things. The carpet still bore the faded outlines of where the grand dining table used to sit. The walls still wore the sun-bleached ghosts of picture frames that once displayed family portraits posed and perfect, frozen in the illusion of togetherness. And yet, standing there alone, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom, strange and unfamiliar, but unmistakably mine. I walked slowly through each room, letting the creaks beneath my feet narrate a story I had long since buried. The kitchen, once pristine and hostile, still carried the faint scent of my mother's lavender cleaning spray. I remembered sitting at that counter, maybe 12 years old, trying to tell her about a bad day at school, only for her to wave me off mid-sentence and remind me that appearances mattered more than feelings. The living room, with its stiff leather furniture and untouchable decorative pillows, was where my father used to sit in silence behind his newspaper while I waited, day after day, for some kind of acknowledgement that never came. Even the hallway closet whispered remnants of childhood, rain boots I wasn't allowed to wear in public, boxes of games we were never permitted to play unless guests were over. I paused at the foot of the staircase and looked up toward the bedrooms, but I didn't climb. I didn't need to. I already knew what waited there, memories packed in rigid rows, quiet disappointments stored beneath matching duvet covers. I wasn't here to revisit the past, not really. I was here to reclaim something they never thought I'd take back, my place in the story, not as their dutiful daughter, but as a woman who finally saw through the veneer of control and chose something better. I had no intention of moving into the house. It wasn't mine in the way a home is meant to be. It was a relic of a life I had walked away from and survived. Instead, I'd already signed the paperwork to donate it to a local nonprofit that provided transitional housing for women escaping abusive situations. The irony wasn't lost on me. This house, once a monument to control, appearance, and silent power, would now be a refuge, a sanctuary for women rebuilding their lives from the rubble of pain. That, to me, was justice, not vengeance, not retribution, but transformation. A space that once held my silence would now carry the voices of women who deserve to be heard. On my last walk through the place, I left behind one thing, tucked into the empty drawer of what used to be my bedroom nightstand, folded carefully beneath a torn corner of my old wallpaper. It wasn't a letter to my parents. I had nothing more to say to them, no final words, no carefully phrased message to tie things off neatly. Instead, I wrote a letter to my younger self, the girl who used to lie awake at night wondering why her love never seemed quite enough, who tried to earn warmth with obedience and traded authenticity for approval until she could barely recognize her own reflection in the mirror. I told her everything I wish someone had told me back then, that it's not your job to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's expectations, that love without acceptance is just another form of control, and that sometimes walking away is the most radical act of self-preservation you'll ever commit. I told her that one day she'd be standing right here, not as a daughter begging for scraps of affection, but as a woman who had built her own definition of family, of peace, of legacy. And as I stepped outside and closed the door behind me for the last time, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The house would tell its own truth now, not in my voice, but in the laughter of children who would feel safe there, in the footsteps of women who wouldn't have to tiptoe around fragile egos, in the warmth of meals shared without judgment or performance. They wanted a daughter who obeyed. I became a woman who chose peace over approval. And maybe, just maybe, that's the better legacy.